The stamp came down before Caius finished pulling out his second document. That was the first sign. Not a slow process. Not a careful review. The officer's hand moved like the decision had already been filed somewhere he couldn't see. In a room he was never invited into, by people whose names he would never know. The airport was cold in the way that government buildings are always cold. Not because of the temperature, but because of what they do inside them. Fluorescent lights, hard floors, lines that moved people like packages. Caius stood at the counter with his documents spread flat on the surface, and he watched the officer's eyes skip over them the way a person skips a paragraph they already know ends badly. He reached for the notepad he always carried. The officer didn't wait. "Sir, your status has been reviewed and a removal order has been processed. You'll need to proceed to gate 14 immediately." Caius wrote fast. One word. The officer didn't look at the notepad. Hi viewers. Have you ever been in a situation where you tried to speak up, but it felt like no one was even looking at you? Drop a yes or a no in the comments right now. He turned the notepad around anyway, held it flat against the counter. The officer was already reaching for the next folder. The line behind Caius shifted. Someone coughed. The world kept moving the way it always moved, without him. He turned. 3 men stood 20 feet back, past the rope line, in the kind of stillness that didn't belong in a busy airport terminal. They weren't holding phones. They weren't checking boards. They were watching him. Riven, the tallest, with the neck tattoo just visible above his collar. Torin beside him, arms crossed, jaw set. Soren slightly apart from both, the way he always was, like he existed in a room slightly adjacent to whatever room everyone else was in. Caius looked at Riven first. Riven looked away. He looked at Torin. Torin's eyes dropped to the floor. He looked at Soren last, because Soren always held eye contact longest, because Soren was the one who sometimes acted like Caius's silence was a language worth learning. Soren turned away. The officer tapped the counter twice. "Sir, gate 14. Caius picked up his documents. His hands didn't shake, which surprised him. He thought they would shake. He had imagined this moment. Not this exact moment, but moments like it. And in every version his hands shook. But they didn't. They were completely still, which somehow felt worse. He walked toward gate 14. Behind him, none of them moved. He didn't look back after that. Not because he didn't want to, but because the answer was already there in the way they stood. Like men who had already said goodbye in a room Caius was never allowed inside. He reached the gate. An attendant was already holding a boarding pass with his name on it. Already printed. Already ready. That was when something shifted in Caius's chest. Not grief, something colder than grief. Something that came from logic, not feeling. He hadn't checked in. He hadn't gone to a kiosk. He hadn't spoken to anyone except the officer at the counter. And that conversation lasted less than 90 seconds. But this attendant was holding a boarding pass with his full name printed on it, in the correct gate at the correct time, like the whole process had been set in motion hours before he walked through those doors. He took the boarding pass. He looked down at it. And in the bottom corner, where a passenger's own signature was supposed to confirm consent for travel, the line wasn't blank. Someone had already signed it. The signature wasn't his. 3 months before the airport, Caius had started keeping a second notepad. Not for conversations. Not for the words he couldn't say out loud. This one was for patterns. Because there were patterns. They started small. The kind of small that a person talks himself out of noticing, because noticing means accepting that something is wrong, and accepting that something is wrong means having to figure out what to do about it, and Caius already had enough to figure out. But the patterns kept showing up. The man who followed him from the pharmacy to the parking lot on a Wednesday afternoon. Caius had written it down. Tan jacket. Stopped when I stopped. Left when I turned around. He had crossed it out the same night. Then uncrossed it the next morning. The phone call that came to his apartment. Not his cell, his landline, which almost no one had, and when he answered, There was nothing but breathing and then a click. The appointment he had at the clinic that got canceled by someone who wasn't him, rescheduled for a different day, moved to a different location across town, and when he arrived at the new location, the receptionist had already pulled his file before he wrote his name on the sign-in sheet. He wrote all of it down. Second notepad. Back pocket. Never left it in the apartment. And then the outcome started. The man in the tan jacket. Caius saw him once more, outside his building the following Tuesday. He wrote it down. By Thursday, the man was gone. Not just gone from Caius's street. Caius looked for him. He didn't look like a man who had simply moved on. He looked like a man who had been moved. There was a situation at his job. A supervisor, not his direct one, someone 2 levels above, had started asking questions about his schedule. Nothing aggressive, just questions. What time did Caius usually leave? Did he take the same route? Did he have family in the city? Caius wrote it down. For days later, that supervisor transferred to a different facility. No announcement. Just gone. A lease renegotiation that was supposed to push Caius out of his apartment. His landlord had brought a representative. A man in a gray suit who spoke very fast and used language Caius couldn't easily challenge in writing. Collapsed without explanation. The representative never came back. The landlord called 2 days later and said the terms were staying the same. Caius sat with all of it. He thought about probability. He thought about coincidence. He was not a man who believed in luck, good or bad, as a force that operated selectively. Things didn't just resolve themselves. Problems didn't disappear because the universe decided to be kind. Someone was managing his situation. He didn't know who. He didn't know when it started. He didn't know what they wanted in return. What he knew was that he hadn't been asked. Not once. Not a note. Not a message. Not even a look across a room that said we see what's happening and we're handling it. Nothing. Just outcomes. Just resolved problems and vanished threats and a life that kept running smoothly, almost suspiciously smoothly, in a way that a mute, unconnected person's life was not supposed to run. He started watching Riven, Torin, and Soren more carefully. He already knew them. That was its own complicated thing. The history between them, the weight of it, the way it sat in a room when they were all in the same space together. But he watched them now with different eyes. He watched the way conversations stopped when he walked into a space they occupied. He watched the way Torin's eyes moved to his phone sometimes, a quick check, the kind you do when you're tracking something. He watched the way Soren positioned himself, always slightly between Caius and an exit, never drawing attention to it, probably not even fully conscious of doing it. It looked like attention. It didn't feel like care, because care came with information. Care came with someone saying, here is what we know, here is what we're doing, here is why. What Caius was receiving was the outcome of care without any of the communication, which, from the outside, was almost impossible to distinguish from control. He found his personal file on a Tuesday morning. He had requested it 3 weeks earlier through the administrative system at his workplace, a standard request, the kind anyone was entitled to make. When it arrived, he opened it at his desk during his lunch break, scanning through the pages the way a person does when they expect to find nothing interesting. 7 pages were missing. Not blank. Not redacted with black bars the way official redactions looked. Just gone. The page numbers skipped. The document went from page 11 to page 19, and the gap sat there like a room with the door removed. You could see the space where something used to be. He stared at it for a long time. He closed the folder. He opened the second notepad. He wrote, someone took 8 pages. Not the system. Person. He put the pen down. He looked up. Soren was standing in the doorway of the break room across the hall, holding a coffee cup, looking directly at him. Not caught. Not pretending to look somewhere else. Just looking, the way a man looks when he's already decided something and is waiting for the moment to arrive. Caius wrote 1 word on the notepad and held it up. Soren's jaw moved slightly, like he was deciding something. like the sentence was already formed and the only question was whether to release it. He said it quietly enough that no one else in the hallway would catch it. "You're safer if you don't understand." Then he walked away. Caius sat with that sentence for the rest of the afternoon. He turned it over. He tested it from every angle. And the part that kept snagging, the part that wouldn't let him put it down, was not the word safer. It was the word if. The morning of the airport, Caius woke up at 4:47 a.m. without an alarm. That was not normal for him. He was a man who slept heavily when he slept at all, who needed the alarm and sometimes needed it twice. But that morning his eyes opened on their own, in the dark, and the first thing he felt was wrong. Not fear, not dread, something quieter than both. The feeling of a door that's been left slightly open when you specifically remember closing it. He lay still for 30 seconds. Then he got up. His apartment looked the same. Nothing moved. Nothing taken. But there was a large envelope on the kitchen counter that he did not put there, sitting next to his coffee maker like it had always been there, like it belonged. His name was printed on the front. No return address. No postage. Slid under the door or left by someone with a key. Either way, someone had been inside his space or close enough to it while he slept. He opened the envelope. Inside, a one-way airline ticket, his full legal name, a departure time 7 hours from that moment. A destination international. A single typed note that said your documents are in order. Proceed to Terminal B. No signature. He read it twice. He set it down. He picked it back up. There was no version of this that was a mistake. This was not a misfiled package, not an accidental delivery. His name was on it. His flight. His destination. Someone had arranged this and left it in his kitchen in the middle of the night like it was a courtesy. He had 2 hours before he needed to leave if he was going to make the flight. He didn't call anyone. There was no one to call. He pulled out the second notepad and he wrote in small careful letters. They decided this already. I am being informed, not asked. He stared at the sentence. He didn't cross it out. He packed one bag. The drive to the airport, the security line, the walk through Terminal B. All of it moved with a smoothness that felt engineered. No delays. His documents processed without a second look. His bag went through screening without being pulled aside. Like every point of friction had been pre-cleared. He got to the counter. The officer stamped without reading. And then the boarding pass. Already printed. The signature in the corner that wasn't his. He stood at gate 14 for 11 minutes before boarding began. He didn't sit. He stood facing the window with the tarmac spread out in front of him. The plane already there and waiting, and he worked through it one more time. The missing pages. Soren's sentence. The envelope in the kitchen. The signature. This wasn't a malfunction in the system. Someone had constructed this. Every piece of it. The timing. The documents. The cleared path. Someone had decided at some point that Caius would be on this flight, and they had spent what sounded like considerable effort making sure the decision could not be reversed. He turned around once before he boarded. Riven was near the back wall, standing with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching, not moving toward him, just watching. Caius looked at him for 3 full seconds. Riven didn't come forward. He looked for Torin. Torin was 40 feet to the left, near a pillar, eyes on his phone. The phone was pointed at the ground. He wasn't reading anything. His thumb wasn't moving. He was using the phone as a reason to look somewhere other than at Caius. Soren was the last. Soren was standing alone near the far side of the gate. And when Caius's eyes found him, Soren's head turned, not away, just slightly to the side, like a man who wanted to look but couldn't make himself hold the weight of what it meant to look. The boarding call went out. Caius faced forward. He walked down the jetway. The door sealed behind the last passenger 20 minutes later. The plane began to move. He sat with his notepad on his knee and the second notepad in his back pocket and his single bag in the overhead compartment, and he watched the airport pull away through the small oval window beside him. He thought about the signature. Not his. Someone else had signed for him, had authorized his removal in his name on his behalf, without his knowledge or his voice or his consent. And 3 people who had the reach to make threats disappear and leases hold and supervisors transfer. 3 people who had clearly known what was coming, had stood in that terminal and watched him walk to the gate. None of them had stopped it. He wrote 1 sentence in the second notepad. No one stopped it. He looked at the sentence. He added 4 words, and that told me everything. The plane lifted. Below, the city pulled away. Lights, roads, the hard geometry of a place he had tried to belong to. And beneath the anger and the cold confusion and the thing he refused to name as grief, one question sat perfectly still and perfectly clear. If they had been protecting him all this time, who gave the order to stop? The town was called Marin's Bluff. It was the kind of place that showed up on maps but not in conversations. 1 grocery store, 1 clinic, 1 bus line that ran twice a day and smelled like diesel and old upholstery. The houses sat far enough apart that a person could go 3 days without seeing a neighbor, and the neighbors, when they did appear, had the particular brand of politeness that meant I will not ask questions and I expect the same from you. Caius had not chosen it. He had been given an address. It arrived the same way the airline ticket had. An envelope, this time at the hostel where he'd been placed for the first 4 nights after landing. His name, no sender. Inside a key, a paper with a street address, and a printed note that said utilities are on. Refrigerator is stocked. Do not contact previous residents. He went, because what was the alternative? The house was small and clean and furnished in the specific way that furnished rentals are furnished. Nothing personal, nothing that remembered anyone. A gray couch. A wooden table. Blinds that closed all the way. A bed with white sheets and 2 pillows, which felt like a strange detail. 2 pillows for a person who was clearly meant to be alone here, and Caius stood in the bedroom doorway for a moment looking at the second pillow before he turned away from it. He got a job at a packaging facility 20 minutes from the house by bus. It was the kind of job where no one needed to talk to him, and he didn't need to talk to anyone. Shift work, physical, the kind of labor that was paid in cash on Fridays and didn't ask for a social security number that still had complications attached to it. The supervisor was a woman named Delmarva who communicated almost entirely through nods and hand signals and seemed to consider Caius's silence to be a professional asset rather than a liability. He worked. He came home. He ate. He slept. The patterns started again within the first 2 weeks. He noticed it the way he had learned to notice things, quietly, from the side, the way you look at something bright. The money first. His account, the one he had not given to anyone in this country, the one he had opened 3 days after arriving with the minimum deposit, gained funds he hadn't deposited. Not large amounts. Enough to cover the difference between what rent cost and what the packaging job paid. Enough to make the math work without him having to make hard choices about food. He checked the transaction history 3 times. The deposits came from a numbered account. Untraceable in the specific way that things are untraceable when someone with resources has deliberately made them that way. Then the medical records. He registered at the local clinic for a basic intake, the kind of registration that should have started from 0, new country, new system, no history transferred. But when the nurse pulled up his file, there was already information in it. His blood type, his allergy list, a notation about his vocal condition, the full clinical description, the one that took 2 specialists and a documented history to establish, already entered, already correct. The nurse read through it without reacting, the way medical staff read things they've been briefed on. He wrote on his notepad, "Who sent this file?" The nurse looked up, looked back at the screen and said, "It came through a forwarding request from your previous provider." He wrote, "I didn't submit a forwarding request." She paused, looked at the screen again. "The request was submitted on your behalf by a authorized representative." He wrote, I don't have an authorized representative. She printed something from the screen, looked at it, set it face down, and smiled the way people smile when they've been told to be helpful and nothing more. We'll make sure your records are correct. Just fill out the intake form. He filled out the intake form. He walked home. He wrote in the second notepad. Doctor already knew before I arrived. Records don't self-transfer. Someone rebuilt my file here before I came. He stared at it. He added, they didn't let me land without infrastructure. This was prepared. He sat with that. Someone had built a life for him here. Not a full life, not a good life, not a life with warmth in it or choice in it or the particular weight of a place you've decided belongs to you. But a functioning life. Roof. Income supplement. Medical access. Job that asked no questions. A life that could sustain a person without drawing attention. He started paying attention to the edges. The spaces outside the house after dark. The car that parked on the far end of his street twice a week. Not always the same car, but always the same position, always angled toward his front door. The grocery deliveries that showed up on his step once every 10 days, from no service he had signed up for, containing the specific items that someone would need to know his preferences to include. He wrote all of it down. He was not being abandoned. He was being managed from a distance so precise it had texture. And the question that replaced all other questions, louder now, more specific, was not why did they send me away. That question had answers, probably, somewhere in the 8 missing pages, somewhere in a conversation he was never allowed into. The question was, how long had this been planned? Because the house, the records, the account, the distance watching, this did not happen in 4 days. This did not happen in a week. This was infrastructure. This was something someone had been constructing before the envelope appeared in his kitchen. Before the airport. Maybe long before. He stood at his kitchen window that night and looked at the street and thought about timelines. About how far back a decision like this had to be made. About what kind of person, what kind of organization, had the reach to rebuild someone's daily life in a foreign country and then simply wait. And then he realized something that sat in his chest like a stone dropped in still water. He had never made a single decision in this process. Not one. From the envelope to the ticket to the address to the job to the account, every piece had been arranged. Every variable had been handled. He had been moved through this relocation the way something valuable gets moved. Carefully. With padding. With a destination already selected. They hadn't abandoned him. They had relocated him. And that distinction, the difference between those two things, kept him awake until the sky outside started going from black to gray. Because one of them meant he didn't matter. And the other one meant he mattered enough to be hidden. It started with the mornings. Caius had always been a consistent sleeper, out fast, under heavy, up when the alarm said. But somewhere in the 3rd week after he arrived in Marin's Bluff, the mornings started going wrong. He woke up tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. He stood in the kitchen at 6 a.m. and looked at the food in the refrigerator. The stocked, pre-selected, someone else chose this food, and felt his stomach pull back from things it had always accepted without comment. He wrote it off. Stress. Adjustment. The body doing what bodies do when the circumstances change faster than the nervous system can accommodate. The 3rd week became the 4th. The nausea arrived in the afternoons, which was the part that didn't make sense. Morning sickness. That phrase existed for a reason. Caius knew the phrase the way everyone knew it, the way it sat in common knowledge without requiring a personal stake in it. But this came in the afternoons. Around 2 or 3, when the shift at the packaging facility hit its midpoint and the ambient smell of cardboard and industrial adhesive was at its strongest. He would put down whatever he was holding and breathe through his nose and wait for it to pass. It always passed. He didn't write it down. Not yet. Week 5. He was standing in the bathroom one morning, and he caught his own reflection, and something in the angle of his face looked different to him in a way he couldn't name. Not sick. Not worse. Just different in the way that a familiar room looks different when the furniture has been shifted 2 inches. The math is off, the dimensions are wrong, but you can't point to the specific thing that changed. He stood there for longer than he meant to. He went to work. He came home. He stood in the kitchen and did the math that he had been refusing to do for 2.5 weeks. He did it the way he did everything, quietly on paper without saying anything out loud that he couldn't take back. He wrote down dates. He wrote down the timeline. He crossed out 2 possibilities. He was left with 1. He put the pen down. He picked it back up. He wrote 1 word and then sat looking at it for a very long time. He had no one to ask. That was the specific shape of this particular problem. He had no one to call, no one to write a message to, no one sitting across a table who could say here is what this means or here is what you do next. He had Delmarva at the packaging facility, who communicated through nods. He had a nurse at the clinic who had been briefed to be helpful and nothing more. He had the street outside his window and the car that parked twice a week and the groceries that arrived every 10 days from a source he couldn't trace. He made an appointment at the clinic. He wrote routine check in the reason field. The nurse who checked him in was a different one than before. Young. Thorough. She took vitals without asking unnecessary questions, which he appreciated. The waiting room was almost empty. A man with a bandaged hand. A woman with a child. Caius. He sat with his second notepad in his lap and didn't write anything. The doctor came in after 11 minutes. His name was Dr. Ambrose Kettley. He shook Caius's hand, pulled a rolling stool to the side of the exam table, and reviewed the intake information on his tablet with the particular kind of focused stillness that meant he had already formed a preliminary picture and was deciding how to approach it. He ordered a blood draw. He ordered a scan. He said these things without much preamble, without the small talk that sometimes arrived before the actual information. Caius appreciated that too. The results came back in 40 minutes. Dr. Kettley walked back into the room with the tablet and stood at the door for a moment in the specific way that doctors stand when they are deciding how to say a thing rather than whether to say it. He sat down on the rolling stool. He turned the tablet so Caius could see the screen. He walked through the numbers in a flat, careful voice, the kind of voice that stays level because it has been trained to stay level, because the patient is in the room and the patient needs information delivered and not performed. Caius looked at the screen. He looked at the numbers. He looked at the image on the lower half of the screen, the dark gray oval on the scan, the dense cluster of data points that the software had highlighted in 3 separate places, each one tagged with a different marker. He wrote on his notepad, "What does this mean?" Dr. Kettley looked at the notepad. He looked back at the scan. He was quiet for 4 seconds. Then he said carefully, the way a man says something he has said before but never quite believed he'd have to say again. "This shouldn't be possible." Caius looked at the scan. He looked at the 3 markers. And the thing inside him that had been refusing to form a complete thought for 5 weeks, the thing he had been writing around instead of writing directly, arrived, fully formed all at once. He put the notepad face down on his knee. He looked at the wall. Outside the clinic window, the town of Marin's Bluff went on doing what it always did, quiet, slow, unremarkable. The bus on its twice-daily route. The neighbors who didn't ask questions. The car that parked on his street twice a week and watched from a distance that was close enough to be deliberate and far enough to be deniable. And Caius sat in that exam room and understood, for the first time with his full attention, that the thing he was carrying, the thing that shouldn't be possible, was going to change every calculation that had been made about why he was here, and who had sent him, and exactly how much danger the distance was supposed to protect him from. The doctor was still talking. Caius had stopped hearing him. He was already thinking about the car on his street. What would you have done in Caius's position? Would you have gotten on that plane? Or would you have walked away? Tell me below and don't hold back. 3. Dr. Kettley said it once, then said it again like he was testing whether the word would hold its shape the second time. 3. Caius sat on the edge of the exam table with the scan image still on the tablet screen in front of him, and he looked at the 3 markers, each one distinct, each one with its own cluster of data around it, and he felt something in his body go very, very still. Not shock. Something past shock. The place a person reaches when the information is so large that the emotional response hasn't caught up yet, and what fills the gap is just clarity. Cold and total. He picked up his notepad. He wrote, all three. Dr. Kettley looked at what he'd written. Nodded once. All three. Yes. Caius wrote. Alpha signatures. The doctor's pause was longer this time. He looked at the screen. He looked at Caius. He set the tablet down on the counter and clasped his hands in front of him the way people do when they are choosing every word before they release it. The markers are consistent with yes. All three carry dominant genetic signatures, which is, he stopped. Caius waited, which is extremely rare. I want to be clear about that. This combination, the multiples, the dominant signatures, the concurrent development, this is not something I've seen in a clinical setting. I've read about it. Case studies, historical documentation, but in practice, he picked up the tablet again and looked at the scan like it might have changed. In practice, this is the kind of result that gets reported, that gets reviewed. Caius wrote, reviewed by who? Kettley looked at the notepad. His mouth opened slightly, closed. Standard medical oversight channels, he said. Protocol requires. Caius was already writing. Who already has access to my file here? Silence. Kettley's eyes moved to the counter, to the tablet, back to Caius. And in that movement, in the specific quality of that pause, was the answer. Someone already did. Caius got off the exam table. He gathered his notepad. He put his jacket on one arm at a time, slowly, the way a person moves when they are deciding what to do with the next 10 minutes while also deciding what to do with the rest of their life. He wrote one last thing before he left. Don't file the report yet. Kettley looked at it. He didn't agree. He didn't disagree. He just looked at it with the expression of a man who understood more than his position allowed him to say. Caius walked out through the waiting room, past the man with the bandaged hand, who was still there, past the woman with the child, through the glass door and out into the gray afternoon air of Marin's Bluff, where the bus was pulling up to the stop across the street right on schedule. He didn't take the bus. He walked. He needed to move. He needed his body doing something so his mind could work without the excess noise. He took the long route home, down Carver Street, past the hardware store, past the empty lot where someone had started a building project and then stopped and left the frame standing, exposed beams pointing at the sky like questions. He thought about three signatures, three dominant markers, three children who didn't exist yet outside of a scan image but who had already, apparently, become information in someone's system. He thought about what Kettley had said. This is the kind of result that gets reported. He turned onto his street. He stopped. The car that usually parked at the far end, the one that appeared twice a week angled toward his door, was gone. That wasn't unusual on its own. But in its place, parked directly in front of his house, was a white sedan he had never seen before. Engine off. Windows up. The kind of car that didn't belong to any of his neighbors because his neighbors drove trucks and older models, and this sedan was clean and recent and had no identifying marks. Two people inside. He could see the outlines through the glass. He didn't slow his pace. He turned into the narrow walkway between two houses, moved through the backyards the way he'd clocked once as a possible alternate route on his third day here, and came out on the next street over. He pulled out his notepad. He wrote, they requested access to the file. They came the same day. He stood there in the cold. And then, below that sentence, in slightly harder pen pressure, the way a person writes when the thought costs something, the children are already targets. That was the moment the fear arrived. Not for himself. For them. The first time someone asked about the children directly, Caius was in the grocery store on a Wednesday. He was in the canned goods aisle, back half, near the soups, and a man appeared at the end of the aisle who didn't move like someone shopping. He moved like someone who had already found what he was looking for and was taking his time about approaching it. Medium height, gray zip-up, the kind of face that was designed to be forgettable. Not ugly, not distinctive, just average in every measurement, like someone had assembled it to pass without registering. He stopped 2 feet away, looked at the soup shelf and said, without looking at Caius, "Due date's coming up fast. You planning to stay local?" Caius went still. The man still wasn't looking at him. He picked up a can, turned it over, put it back. "There are people who specialize in situations like yours," he said. "Complicated." He set it on the shelf in front of Caius and walked away down the aisle, turned the corner and was gone. Caius stood there for 30 seconds. Then he picked up the card and looked at it. Then he set it back down. Then he left the store without the groceries and walked home in under 12 minutes, which was 4 minutes faster than usual. That was the first time. The second time was a woman. Outside the clinic the following Tuesday, sitting on the bench near the parking lot like she was waiting for a ride. She didn't approach him. She just watched him walk to the door, and as he passed she said, quietly, "The offer is generous. It won't stay open." He didn't stop walking. Third time, a phone call to the landline. He had almost disconnected the landline twice and hadn't, because the landline was one of the pieces of infrastructure that had already been set up when he arrived, and disconnecting pieces of the established system felt like a risk he hadn't fully calculated. He picked it up. A voice, male, calm, professional, said, "We understand your situation is complicated. We can simplify it. The children would be well cared for." Children, plural, specific. Caius hung up. He sat down on the kitchen floor. Not the chair, the floor, with his back against the cabinet and his hands on his knees, and he thought about what was in front of him very carefully. 3 separate approaches. 3 different people. 3 different methods, casual, direct, clinical. But the same information underneath all of them. They knew about the pregnancy. They knew about the multiples. They knew about the signatures. That information had only existed in one place. Dr. Kettley's file. Which meant the report had gone out. Despite what Caius had asked. Despite the notepad. Despite Kettley's long pauses and careful word choices, the protocol had won, and the information had traveled. And it had traveled somewhere that fed into a network that sent a man in a gray zip-up to stand in a canned goods aisle and offer compensation for 3 children who hadn't been born yet. He thought about the word the man had used. Not babies. Not infants. Assets. He hadn't used that word explicitly, but the construction of the sentence, the phrasing, the way it was framed around value and compensation and high signature, that was the vocabulary of acquisition. That was the language of a transaction, not a service. Caius got up off the floor. He went to the bedroom. He pulled a bag from the closet. Not the one he'd packed for Marin's Bluff, a smaller one, a go bag, which he had assembled in week 2 because the pattern-keeping part of his brain had told him to, and he checked it. Documents. Cash. The second notepad. A change of clothes. A prepaid phone he'd bought with cash from the hardware store 3 weeks earlier. He set the bag by the door. He went back to the kitchen. He stood at the window and looked at the street. The white sedan from 2 weeks ago wasn't there. Different car now. Blue, older model. Parked half a block down. 1 person inside. He had been wrong about something. He had thought, in the first weeks, that the distance was a punishment. That the relocation was a form of disposal. The system processing him out because he had become inconvenient. He had grieved it that way. Had held it the way a person holds something they've been told to put down but can't. But this, the approaches, the offers, the surveillance that had ramped up in direct proportion to the information released by the medical report. This wasn't the behavior of people following up on something discarded. This was the behavior of people circling something valuable. He hadn't been abandoned. He had been hidden. And someone had just told the wrong people where he was. He looked at the prepaid phone. He looked at the bag by the door. He looked at the street. He wrote in the second notepad, in the small careful letters he always used for the things that mattered most. I wasn't abandoned. I was hidden. The hiding just failed. He underlined the last 3 words. Then he sat down to wait, because the one thing he had learned in all of it was that acting before you understood the full shape of a situation was how people got caught in the middle of someone else's plan. He would wait, but not long. Back in the United States, something was moving. Not loudly. That mattered. The things that moved loudly drew attention, drew resistance, drew the kind of legal and institutional pushback that slowed everything down. What was moving now moved the way water moves under ice. Steady, invisible, and absolutely certain of where it was going. A man named Deshaun Virex, mid-level administrator, Immigration Processing Division, 11 years in the department, was placed on administrative leave on a Monday morning. By Wednesday, his access credentials had been deactivated across 4 separate federal systems. By Friday, his supervisor, a woman named Patricia Gould who had processed over 400 removal orders in the past 18 months, had requested early retirement. It was granted within 48 hours, which was not how early retirement requests typically moved. A name appeared in a sealed internal audit, Verek Virex. That name mattered. Pause on that. A subcontractor who had provided digital processing support to the Immigration Division. A firm called Aerith Solutions, incorporated 3 years ago, principal owner listed as a trust account, had its contract flagged for irregular activity. 6 contracts. 4 of them involved expedited processing. 2 of them involved removals that had bypassed the standard review queue. All 6 had been processed in the same 18-month window. All 6 involved subjects connected to bloodline classifications that the department was not, officially, supposed to be tracking. This mattered enormously, because bloodline classification in an immigration context had one source, a secondary data stream that ran parallel to the official system, maintained not by the department itself but by a private network that contracted to it. A network that had its own interests, its own clients, its own reasons for wanting certain people in certain places, or certain people out of them. Someone had fed information into that network. Someone had flagged Caius specifically. And the 3 men whose names were not in any of these documents, whose fingerprints were not on any of these files, had been working backward from that fact for 6 months. Quietly, methodically, the way people work when they are angry in a direction that has no outlet yet. Riven Virex had not slept a full night since the airport. That was not a figure of speech. He had a documented record of it, not medical, nothing that put anything in a system, but his housekeeper knew, and his driver knew, and the building security team knew, because Riven moved through the building at 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. the way a man moves when lying still has become intolerable. Torin Virex had cleared his schedule in the 3rd month. All of it. Every social engagement, every board appearance, every event that had his name attached to it. His assistant had sent regrets on his behalf to 43 separate invitations. Torin had not explained why. He did not explain things. Soren Virex had gone somewhere else entirely. He had taken a leave from the firm, formal, documented, approved, and had been, as far as anyone outside could determine, traveling. A cabin in the Pacific Northwest. Property in Montana. A rented house in a city that didn't appear in his public records. Soren had been building a file. Not a legal file, not yet. Something else. The kind of documentation that a person assembles when they intend to be very, very certain before they move, because moving incorrectly in a situation this specific would not just fail, it would make things worse. The name surfaced on a Thursday afternoon. Verek Virex. Father. The man who had built 3 sons and then, when those sons had made a choice he had not approved, had used the architecture of his own influence to undo the consequences of that choice. Who had decided unilaterally, from a position of absolute certainty that his judgment superseded everyone else's, that Caius was a destabilizing element. A variable that introduced risk into a carefully managed system. A person who carried a bloodline classification that, when combined with what Caius was, produced outcomes that Verek Virex had decided were not acceptable. He had not asked his sons. He had not warned them. He had simply activated the network. Riven found out on a Tuesday. He sat with the information for 45 minutes in a closed office with no one else present. And when he came out, his face was exactly the same as when he had gone in, which was its own kind of terrifying to the people who knew him well. Torin found out by reading the document Soren had compiled. He read it straight through once. Then he stood up, walked to the window, and stood there for a very long time without turning around. Soren already knew. He had known for 3 weeks before he showed either of his brothers. He had waited because he needed to know the full shape of it before it became shared. Because once it was shared, it would become action, and action could not be taken back. The document showed something else. Buried in the back half of Soren's file, in the section that tracked Varric's network communications for the past 8 months, the ones that had been routed through Aerith Solutions' secondary server, which Soren had accessed through methods that would not withstand legal scrutiny but which had produced extraordinarily accurate results, was a log. Outbound communications to a regional contact. A specific region. A specific address. Caius's address. Not from Riven. Not from Torin. Not from Soren. From the network Varric had used to send him there. The same network was now requesting access to the medical file. The same network had sent the man in the gray zip-up and the woman at the clinic bench and the clinical voice on the landline. The same network had taken Caius out of one situation and now, because the situation had changed in a way no one had anticipated, in a way that made Caius significantly more valuable to the right buyers, was circling back. Varric had not authorized the second approach. That was in the file too, which meant the network had gone independent. Which meant the people circling Caius in Marin's Bluff were not operating under the original terms anymore. They had their own agenda. And Caius, alone in a small house in a town that didn't show up in conversations, 7 months along, 3 children who had already been described by someone as assets, had no idea that the architecture of the situation had shifted underneath him. Riven looked at the address on the last page of Soren's file. He didn't say anything. He stood up. Torin was already moving. The blue car outside had been replaced by a black one. Caius noticed it on a Thursday morning when he opened the blinds. Same position as the blue one. Half a block down, angled toward the door but newer. Less visible from the kitchen window because of the way it sat lower to the street. Someone had made an adjustment. That adjustment told him something specific. It told him they'd realized he was watching. He made coffee. He stood at the counter and drank half of it and thought about the go bag by the door. He had added things to it over the past 2 weeks. A second phone, a printed copy of every document he owned, a small amount of cash he'd been pulling out in increments that wouldn't trigger anything. The bag was ready, had been ready. What he didn't have was a direction. That was the specific gap in his planning. He could leave Marin's Bluff. He'd calculated the route, the bus timing, the train connection 3 towns over that didn't require an ID scan if you paid cash at the window. He could disappear from this address. But disappear to where, and with what, and toward what, and what happened to 3 children in a world where people with resources had already decided they were worth acquiring? Those questions didn't have answers he could write in a notepad. He drank the rest of the coffee. He sat down. And then the landline rang. He looked at it. It rang again. He had stopped answering it after the 3rd call from the network. But this felt different in a way he couldn't immediately justify. Just a difference in the quality of the ring, which was not a rational thing to feel about a telephone. And yet, he picked it up. Silence for 2 seconds. Then, it's Soren. Caius stood completely still. Don't say anything. You don't have to. Just listen. Soren's voice was the same as it always was. Measured, slightly low. The voice of someone who chose each word before speaking rather than after. We know where you are. We've known since the 3rd week. I know how that sounds. I know it doesn't help right now. But there are people near that address who are not us. And they are not there to make sure you're all right. They're there because information got out that shouldn't have. and now there's interest from people who don't have your well-being as a priority. Pause. The man in the gray jacket at the grocery store. The woman outside the clinic. The calls. He knew. Of course he knew. We couldn't reach you before. That's a pause that had texture in it, the kind of pause where a sentence gets rebuilt in real time. There were restrictions on our end. Our father, he stopped, started again. Someone used our family's infrastructure to process your removal without our consent or knowledge. By the time we understood the full scope of what had happened, the legal position was complicated. Challenging it openly would have accelerated the threat to you. So we worked from the outside in. Caius was still standing. His hand on the phone was steady. The people watching your house are not going to stay patient much longer. The medical report changed their timeline. We need you to leave that address tonight. There's a car. Not the ones on your street. A different one. Parked at the hardware store 2 blocks east. Gray truck. The driver's name is Amadeus. Tell him Soren sent you. He'll take you somewhere safe. Caius reached for his notepad. He wrote, "Why didn't you stop the airport?" He held the phone with his shoulder and held the notepad up, which was a useless gesture because Soren couldn't see it and he knew that and he did it anyway. He put the phone back to his ear. "I know that's the question," Soren said, quietly, like he'd been waiting for it for 7 months. "We thought, another rebuild. We were told you had agreed to the relocation. We were told it was your choice, that you wanted distance." By the time Riven pulled the file and found the signature discrepancy, you were already on the plane, and the political exposure of reversing a processed removal order in that window would have created a direct path back to you for the people who flagged you in the first place. He stopped. "That's the explanation, not the apology. Those are different things and I know the difference." The kitchen was very quiet. Caius looked at the window. The black car was still there. He looked at the go bag by the door. He picked up the notepad one more time. Wrote 2 words. Even though Soren couldn't see them, he wrote them, because he needed to write them somewhere. "I know. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Something smaller and more honest than that. The acknowledgement that the shape of the thing was what it was, and standing in front of it clearly was the only way to know what came next." He picked up the go bag. He put on his coat. He wrote one last line in the second notepad. Not for Soren, not for any of them, just for himself, just for the record, before he closed it and put it in the bag. "They didn't leave me. They couldn't reach me. Someone made sure of it." He looked around the small house one time. The gray couch. The wooden table. The second pillow he had never moved. He went out the back. Amadeus was a man in his 50s who drove like someone who had been doing this specific kind of work for a long time and had learned that talking made it harder. He nodded when Caius climbed in. He pulled out of the hardware store lot without rush. He took 3 routes that Caius tracked without being able to identify the logic, except that they avoided the main road and came out 30 minutes later on a highway he didn't recognize. He didn't ask where they were going. He didn't have to. The safe house was in a different county, a property that was large enough to have more than one entrance, more than one exit, a detail that Caius registered immediately and which made something in his chest release very slightly. Amadeus stopped the truck at the front door and said, "Someone's inside. They've been waiting." He got out. He pushed the front door open. Riven was standing in the middle of the living room, not moving, not speaking. Just there, the same way he had always occupied a space. Fully, with the particular gravity of a person who took up room without seeming to try. The neck tattoo, the jacket, the stillness that had always been the most unreadable thing about him. Torin was to his left, near the window, arms at his sides. Soren was standing by the far wall. None of them spoke first. Caius stood in the doorway with the go bag on his shoulder and looked at all 3 of them, and for a moment the only sound was the house, the settling of it, the heat running, the particular silence of a space that had been holding its breath. He walked in. He set the bag down on a chair. He sat down on the couch. He looked at Riven. Riven came forward and sat in the chair across from him. Not close, not distant, but present in the specific way that presence means something after a long absence. He clasped his hands and he looked at Caius with an expression that had a lot of components and no simplification available for any of them. "We weren't there," Riven said. "At the airport. We were there, but we didn't act. And I could give you the full explanation and it's all true and it doesn't change what it looked like. What it felt like." He stopped. "So I'm not going to lead with the explanation." Torin moved from the window. He sat on the arm of the chair near the edge of the room, not close but closer than he'd been. Soren didn't move. He stayed at the wall the way he always had, in the room but giving Caius the space of it. Caius looked at all three of them. He thought about the airport, the stamp, the boarding pass with the signature that wasn't his, the silence of three men who stood in a terminal and watched him walk away. He had carried that for 7 months, the weight of it, the shape of it, the way it sat differently on different days. Some days it felt like proof of something he'd always feared. Other days it just felt like a fact he had to live next to. Today it felt like something he could finally set down. Not because the explanation made it right. Because he was tired of holding it and because these three men were sitting in a room with him in a house that someone had prepared for safety. And because outside that house there were people who had referred to his children as assets. And because whatever the history was, complicated and unasked for and painful in ways he hadn't finished understanding. Right now, tonight, these were the people between him and that. He picked up the notepad. He wrote 2 sentences. He held it out to Riven. "I'm not ready to call it even. But I'm not alone right now. That's what matters tonight." Riven read it. He passed it to Torin. Torin read it without expression, then looked up and nodded once, the kind of nod that didn't perform anything, that just confirmed. Soren crossed the room. He took the notepad. He read it. He set it down on the coffee table carefully, the way a person sets down something they intend to return to. Outside, somewhere down the road, 2 black SUVs that had followed Amadeus's general route at a distance pulled over. 2 minutes later, they reversed course. Someone had communicated something. The watchers had been told, without ceremony or announcement, that the subject was no longer accessible. The network's second approach had found its limit. Inside, no one made a speech about it. Torin moved to the kitchen and came back with 4 glasses of water. Which was not dramatic, which was not a symbol of anything grand, which was just water in a moment when everyone in the room had been moving fast for a long time and all of them were tired. He set one in front of Caius. He sat down. The house held. Caius looked at the 3 of them. Riven with his hands still clasped, Torin with his glass, Soren standing near the window now with his arms loose at his sides, and he thought about silence. About how silence had always been the thing he carried alone, the condition of his life that the world had decided was a deficit. And how, in this room right now, no one was trying to fill it. They weren't performing comfort. They weren't performing anything. They were just there. He looked at the second notepad in the bag at his feet. He thought about the last sentence he had written in it. Alone in the small house in Marin's Bluff before he went out the back door. They didn't leave me. They couldn't reach me. Someone made sure of it. He looked at the room. He looked at the 3 of them. The sentence was still true, but it wasn't the last sentence anymore. He leaned back against the couch, and for the first time in 7 months, the silence around him didn't feel like something he had lost. It felt like something they understood. If you made it to the end of the story, you know this wasn't just about one person finding his way back. It was about what happens when the systems that are supposed to protect people fail, and the people who should have spoken up didn't, and someone had to carry all of it alone. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something you needed to feel today, share it. Someone in your circle needs to hear it. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next on this channel. Every story here is built to remind you that survival is not the end of the story. It's where the real one begins. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what hit you hardest. Your words inspire the next person who finds this channel when they need it most.